When I was in college, one summer I worked as a busboy at the Grand Lake Lodge in Grand Lake, Colorado. Sits on the very edge of the Rocky Mountain National Park, so it's a wonderful place for tourists to visit and stay and eat. Most of the wait staff was from all over the country. They worked seasonally. So in the wintertime, they waited tables in Florida. And in the summertime, they waited tables in Colorado. And one of the wait staff that I worked with was Michael Fox. He was slightly older than I was, mid to late 20s. He was friendly and gregarious. He could talk to anyone from anywhere, that if you had a conversation with him for 5 minutes, you felt like you knew him your entire life. He could have taught a master class in waiting tables. The interesting thing, though, was that he had two different name tags. Both were correct. But when he wore one name tag versus the other, he got more tips. Same waiter, same service, different name tag, more tips. The first name tag simply said, Michael Fox. But the second name tag had his middle initial, Michael J. Fox. He was not on Family Ties or in Back to the Future, but that was his name. And when he wore that name tag, his profit margin went up because it is memorable. And how often do we remember our server's name after dinner? James and John wanted people to remember their names. They go to Jesus and say, Teacher, do for us whatever we ask for you to do. Now, it's always a red flag. When someone says, I need you to do a favor for me, and they want you to agree to the favor before you know what the favor is, that's how you end up helping your neighbor move his couch during the Iron Bowl. And they said, grant that we sit on either side of you, the left and the right, in the middle of your glory. And they did not fully understand what they were asking. They could not envision that the journey of Jesus and his glory would lead them to the cross. It's almost as if James and John weren't paying attention during Sunday school, because the prophet Isaiah is clear. The servant of God will be the one who bears our infirmities, carries our diseases, endures our transgressions, shoulders our iniquities. I will never forget years ago at another place where a church member, first thing Monday morning, walked into the church office clutching the bulletin and upset about worship the day before. And he held up that bulletin, shaking it in front of me, and said, Did you put this quote on the front of the bulletin? I said, Yes. How could you do that? And I looked down, and it was this verse from the prophet Isaiah. It just didn't have the reference to Isaiah next to it. That we might want to think about Jesus in this way. We would much rather envision standing on either side of Jesus in the midst of his glory, like James and John did. But Jesus shifts the entire conversation. Those who want to be first must be slave to all. Admittedly, it's hard for us to hear those words, comparing service to slavery, that we wish the Bible would come out and directly criticize slavery. But the longer we read the Gospels, the more we see that the love of Christ is incongruent with slavery, even in this passage. James Cone, the great African American liberation theologian, writes about this verse. To be a slave to all is to recognize that the struggle of liberation is for all. This recognition does not make one submissive to unjust powers, but humble before Jesus Christ, who is Lord of all. We also have to remember what the Gospel of John says, where Jesus says, I do not call you servants any longer, because the servant does not know what the master is doing, but I have called you friends. In the Greek, it actually says, I do not call you slaves any longer, because slaves do not know what the master is doing, but I have called you friends. That we are to be servants of all because the love of God is for all. That we are to serve, not to be served. Which is not about other people knowing your name. It's also not about having all the answers. In his TED Talk, Ernesto Ciroli talks about going to Zambia, helping promote the development of agriculture. That this group of Italians went carrying all these wonderful seeds to this fertile valley just next to the Zambezi River in southern Zambia. And when they got there, they met the locals and said, see, we brought these seeds. We'll teach you how to grow these things. And they were absolutely uninterested. So they just went about planting the seeds in these ideal conditions. And these beautiful plants, tomatoes and zucchini, started to pop up out of the ground. And they said to the locals, look, see, you can do this. Completely uninterested. And they kept saying, thank goodness we're here to save these poor, uninformed people. But then when the tomatoes became fully ripe, ready to be enjoyed, overnight, this massive group of hippos comes out of the river and eats everything. And the locals go, see, that's why we don't have agriculture. It's not about having all the answers, the one who brings the solutions. It's about coming alongside of one another, not so others know our names, but simply to serve. That we serve because, as John Lewis, that great civil rights leader from Alabama, says, because we all live in the same house. And every house has chores. They are not glorious, but they can convey the love of Christ. That it's really hard to think too highly of yourself when you're washing the dishes. I don't know if it's those attractive gloves that you wear, or the scrub brush or dishpan hands. But we all wash dirty dishes. As Shannon Martin writes, dirty dishes are the tie that binds. That we are bound together by these chores because we live in the same house. And it's how we serve and take care of one another's needs. It's taking food to someone who is sick. It's picking up trash on the side of the road. It's mowing someone's lawn. It's writing a note of support. It's showing up for a family at a funeral. It's asking a young person how school is going. It's sitting with someone who is all alone. It's asking how we can help before we start helping. And none of that is found in the Guinness Book of World Records. They are small tasks that can be full of the love of Christ. And it is interesting that when James and John went to see Jesus, they addressed him as teacher, rabbi. Teacher, do for us whatever we ask. And then Jesus turns around and points to service. Because service is a brilliant teacher. Better than any book we can read or lesson we can plan, that everything that Jesus talks about is found at the end of service. That serving others teaches us that the first will be last and the last will be first. It teaches us that humility is more important than fame. It teaches us that the love of God always forgives. It teaches us that we are to care for the most vulnerable and that light shines in darkness and that the two greatest commandments are to love God and to love neighbor. And it teaches us that God is always at work. That we learn all of those things in ways we could not otherwise. Through service. That these small, seemingly insignificant tasks teach us about the most important gifts from God. Amen.